Now we'll discuss the types of relationships. So what are types of relationships? An entity instance of one entity type that can be associated with an entity instances of other entity type is called as types of relationship. So what is types of relationship? The types of relationship defines an entity instance means one record, an entity instance of one entity type that can be associated with an entity instance of other entity type. It defines the entity instance of an entity instance of one entity type that can be associated with an entity instance of other entity type. So it defines an entity instance of one entity type that can be associated with an entity instances of other entity type is called as types of relationships. There are four types of relationships. There are four types of relationships. There are four types of relationships. They are one-to-one, one-to-one relationship, one-to-many, many-to-one, many-to-many. It defines the entity instance of one entity type that can be associated with an entity instances of other entity type is called as relationship type. There are four types of relationships: one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-one, many-to-many. So what is one-to-one? One-to-one relationship. One-to-one relationship. So what is one-to-one relationship? Each entity instance of one entity type that can be associated with only one entity instance of other entity type is called as a one-to-one relationship. So what is one-to-one? Each entity instance of one entity type or entity type A is associated with only one entity instance of entity type B is called as a one-to-one relationship. Each entity instance of one entity type that can be associated with each entity instance of one entity type that can be associated with only one entity instance of other entity type is called as one-to-one relation. So what is one-to-one? Each entity instance of one entity type that can be associated with the entity instance of other entity type. So let us will take two entity types A and B, for example. So there are two entity instances. For example, this is one entity type. So this is another entity type. There are two entity types. This is one entity type and this is another entity type. here we have the some entity types. This is entity instance. This is one entity instance. So these boxes indicates entity instances. This is entity type. An entity instance of one entity type. This is the one entity. This is the entity type. The entire circle we call as entity type. The square box indicates the entity instance. An entity instance of one entity type that can be associated with only one entity instance of other entity type. So this is called as one-to-one relationship. So here these are the entity instances. This is one entity instance. This is another entity instance. Like this, we have the some entity instances are there. So there are each entity. So there is one-to-one mapping is there. So this is the one. This is an entity instance. This is also another entity instance. An entity instance of A. Suppose this is the entity type A. So if this is the entity type A. This is entity type B. Entity B. So there are two entity types, entity type A and entity type B. So there are three entity instances in A. There are three entity instances in B. So there is one-to-one mapping from A to B. Such a relationship is called as one-to-one relationship. So what is one-to-one? So in one-to-one relationship, an entity instance of A that is associated with an entity instance of other entity type. So that's we called as a one-to-one relationship. Similarly, we go for one-to-many. One-to-many. What is one-to-many relationship? An entity instance of A entity type A is associated with any number of entity instances of is called as one-to-many relationship. So one is one-to-many. So in the case of one-to-many, an entity instance of entity type A is associated with many number of entity instances of entity type B is called as one-to-many relationship. So this is called as one-to-many. An entity instance of entity type A is associated with many number of entity instances of entity type B is called as one-to-many relationship. So we'll go for an example this again. So let us will take the two entity types. This is one entity type. This is another entity type. There are some entity instances are there. So like this, suppose an entity instance, this is the entity instance, we have the arrow. If the relationship is like this, then we called as one to many. So for each entity instance of A, for example, if you take first entity instance in entity type A, is mapped with the two entity instance of entity type B. Similarly, the entity instance in A, second entity instance in A, is mapped with the two entity instances in B. An entity instance in A, in third entity instance in A, is mapped with the three entity instances. So such a relationship we called as a one to many relationship. What is one to many? So in the case of one to many relationship, an entity instance of entity type A is associated with an entity instance of entity type B is associated with many number of entity instances, is associated with many number of entity instances of entity type B is called as one to many relationship. So similarly we go for sorry, this is called as one to similarly we go for another relationship we called as uh, many to one, many to one relationship. What is many to one relationship? So one go for another is called as this is called as now we'll go for one to many relationship. What is one to many? Many to one. Many number of entity instances of A. Many number of entity instances of A. Entity type A is associated with only one entity instance in entity type B is called as many many to one relationship, called as many to one relationship. So that's called as many to one relationship. So what is many to one relationship? So in many to one relationship, an entity instance of so this is one entity instance, many number of entity instances. So suppose we will take one big. Second, we have another entity instance. There are some entity instances. The square box indicates entity instance. We read some more. So let us assume these are the entity instances. These are the entity instances. So this is the relationship from 1 to any number of entity instances of A. Similarly, this is many to this we called as a many to one relationship. So there may be many number of entity instances. This is a one A. So many number of entity instances of A is associated with only one entity instance of entity type B. So that we called as many to one relationship. So this is the another type. Third, next we go for another relationship, many to many relationship. Many to many relationship. What is many to many relationship? In many to many relationship, any number of entity instances of entity type A is associated with any number of entity instances of entity type B. In many to many relationship, in many to many relationship, any number of entity instances of entity instances of entity type A is associated with many number of entity instances of type. So this is called as many to many relationship. In many to many relationship, many number of entity instances of entity type A is associated with many number of entity instances of entity type B. That's we called as many to many relationship. We'll take one example again. So let us assume that there are two entity types This is one entity type. Similarly, we have one more entity type is there. This is also another entity type. There are in some entity instances are there. This is one entity instance. For example, these are the two entity instances. So this we the relationship. There may be any number. Like this. This is the way. So many to many relationships. This is called as many to many. Like this, we have four types of relationships: one, one to many to one, many to many. So what is one to one relationship? In one to one relationship, so we have the four. What is relationships? What is relationship? So type. What is a relationship? Types of relation. So the type of relationship will define the entity instance of one entity type that can be associated with an entity instances of other entity type. That's we called as a type of relationship. There are four types of relationships: one to many to one, many to many. So what is one to one relationship? In one to one relationship, each entity instance of one entity type that can be associated with only one entity instance of other entity type is called as a one to one relationship. What is one to one? So in one to one relationship, each entity instance of one entity type that can be associated with only one entity instance of other entity type is called as a one-to-one relationship. We'll take two. This is an example. So we have two entity types: entity type A and entity type B. Entity type A has three entity instances. Entity type B also has three entity instances. The first entity instance of entity type A is associated with the first entity instance of entity type B. Similarly, the second entity instance of entity type B is A is associated with entity instance like this. So this is called as a one-to-one relationship. So diagram is in one to many relationship. So in one to many, each entity instance of A that can be associated with many number of entity instances of entity type B in one to many. So in one to many, each entity instance of A. So diagram is missing. So deleted diagrams by mistake. I deleted. This is one entity instance. This is also another entity type. So these are the entity instances. So we take one entity instance of A is associated with many number of entity instances of B. Similarly, so this is called as one to many. Each entity instance of A. This is the entity instances 1, 2, 3. So if you assign the number, then it will be good 1, 2, 3. So entity instances of A is associated. One entity instance is associated with many number of entity instances. That's we called as one to many. Similarly, many to one. What is many to one? Many number of entity instances for entity type A is associated with only one entity instance of any entity type B. That is the reverse of one to many. Then what is many to many? In many to many relationship, a many number of entity instances of A is associated with many number of entity instances of entity type B. This is called as many to many. So like this, we have the four types of relationships. This is called as cardinality constraint. We'll also call it as cardinality constraint. What is cardinality constraint? So the number of entity instances of one entity type that can be associated with, that's cardinality. So what is we will also call as, this is called as the cardinality constraint. What is this? So an entity instance of A, that is cardinality means, I already told that cardinality. Cardinality means the number of rows that are available in the table relation is called as cardinality. Cardinality constraint. What is cardinality constraint? In cardinality constraint, the entity instances of one entity type that can be associated with an entity instances of other entity type. There are four types: one, one to many to one, many to many. These are the four types of relationships. So we assign so sometimes somebody will give one, somebody will give one many, like this. Suppose I will take one example. Student join course, for example. Here student is one relation, join is a student is one entity type, course is also another entity type. So this is one student. Student is one entity type. Course is another. Course is one another entity type. Join is the relationship. This is the student. Student. This is the course. Course. This is the join. So join, this is the relationship. So student join course. Student join course, for example. Student join course. Suppose if I write like this, so one, here I will put one, here I will put n. So indicates one to many. Somebody will give like this one and many. Somebody will give the number. So one. So I will look for pen. Insert. Go for new drawings. So So if there is a 1, so this is the, suppose somebody will give, here is the 1, here is 1, 1, n. So if write like this, 1 to this indicates 1 to many. So each entity is, and a student can join many number of courses. That is the relationship. So we'll write 1n, or somebody will give the symbols also. 1, here is the 1, many symbol will give somebody. So 1n, like this depends on the author. They will give different notations. If I write 1n indicates a student can join many number of courses. Then the relationship type is 1 to many relationships. So like this we'll define the relationship type. So similarly, student college can have many number of students, no problem. So similarly, we have the a parent can have children. A parent can have too many number of children. So like this, we have the so many types of relationships are there. So based on the constraint, we can use the relationships. Like this, we have the different types of relationships. We can assign the relationships like this 1 and n. 1 and indicates this is the relationship types. Okay. This is the way. This is about today's topic. Tomorrow we'll discuss the next topic.